Very good morning, friends. Well, first of all, let me wish all the viewers a very happy new year. May this new year bring a lot of prosperity and luck to you. And it brings, of course, a world which is free of any kind of viruses, I hope. Well, in this particular new year, what I started thinking was that what can we do something which is going to be very interesting for the people to watch. In the previous videos, what I have done, I've just tried to, elaborate on certain standard or the other. But this time I thought, let me come out with some unique things in these particular standards. And what I've decided is that I'm going to pick up a few standards and we're going to interpret the language which is given in the standards. Like for example, today I'm going to start with the series on Ind AS 1. And we're going to focus on certain very relevant paras which are not only important from the examination point of view, but also from a practical life point of view. And I want to look into the exact language and interpret the standard with you. Now, today the focus is in terms of Ind AS 1. The journey is starting from Ind AS 1. I think we'll more or less try to go in a chronological order. And in terms of Ind AS 1, there are a couple of issues which are addressed in the standard. But I think when I look at Ind AS 1, the most crucial aspect which is addressed in the standard is the distinction between the current and the non-current, where a company is required to make a balance sheet and it has to make a distinction in terms of the current assets and non-current assets and even the current and the non-current liabilities. Well, today I'm going to focus on the distinction in terms of current and non-current, irrespective whether we're looking at assets or liability. But moving forward, I'm also going to make a discussion with you. And in that particular discussion, I am going to cover the aspect in terms of number one, the current and non-current assets. And then another video, I'm going to cover the concept of current as well as non-current liabilities. So let's, I think, find out in detail what does Ind AS 1 talk in terms of the relevant paras with reference to the current and the non-current. जो बच्चे अपनी तैयारी कर रहे हैं सीए फाइनल मई 22 और नवंबर 22 के लिए, उनके लिए नए साल में शुरू होने जा रहा है योद्धा सीए फाइनल ग्रुप 1 का बैच। योद्धा इसलिए कि हम चाहते हैं कि आप इन एग्जाम्स को एक वॉरियर की तरह क्रैक कीजिए। 5 जनवरी से जितने भी आपके सीए फाइनल के ग्रुप 1 के सब्जेक्ट्स हैं, आपको एक ही सब्सक्रिप्शन के अंदर सब कवर मिलेंगे, जिनके अंदर आपके साथ अलग अलग टॉप एजुकेटर्स जुड़ेंगे अलग अलग सब्जेक्ट्स के लिए, जिनमें लॉ अमित पोपली सर, राहुल मलकान सर एसएफएम, खुशबू सांघवी मैम ऑडिट, और मैं आपके साथ लूंगा फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग। टाइमिंग्स इन सब्जेक्ट्स के अलग अलग हैं जिनमें कोई क्लैश नहीं है। एसएफएम में राहुल मलकान सर लेंगे सैटरडे और संडे 8 to 1 PM, और मेरी फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग की क्लासेस होंगी मंडे टू सैटरडे 6 to 8 AM। लॉ की क्लासेस अमित पोपली सर लेंगे 7 PM to 9 PM, और ऑडिट के अंदर खुशबू सांघवी मैम का बैच रहेगा 10 AM to 12 PM। तो क्लासेस में आपको कोई क्लैश नहीं मिलेगा, ये सभी क्लासेस आप लाइव अटेंड कर सकते हैं। एक सब्सक्रिप्शन के अंदर आपको अनेक फायदे हैं। लाइव इंटरैक्टिव क्लासेस हैं, यदि आपकी क्लासेस मिस हो जाती हैं तो रिकॉर्डेड लेक्चर्स पर आप अनलिमिटेड एक्सेस पाएंगे। डाउट सॉल्विंग सेशंस होते हैं, एवरी 4th सेशन इज अ डाउट सॉल्विंग सेशन। साथ में आपको इसके अंदर मल्टीपल एजुकेटर्स मिलेंगे फॉर ऑल द सब्जेक्ट्स, और साथ में प्रैक्टिस टेस्ट सीरीज भी आपको उपलब्ध होंगी। ये कुछ प्राउड लर्नर्स हैं जिन्होंने अनअकैडमी प्लेटफॉर्म पर अपनी क्लासेस ली, और इसके अंदर आप देख सकते हैं ऑल इंडिया रैंक 1 से लेके ऑल इंडिया रैंक 2, ऑल इंडिया रैंक 3, और आप भी इस लिस्ट के अंदर शामिल हो सकते हैं। बस थोड़ी सी सूझबूझ और प्लानिंग की आवश्यकता है। अलग अलग प्लान्स अवेलेबल हैं जो आपके बजट को और जो आपके टाइमिंग को सूट करता हो। फ्रॉम 3 months ऑनवर्ड्स आप ये प्लान्स अवेल कर सकते हैं, जिन पर आप 10% डिस्काउंट भी अवेल कर सकते हैं, और इस डिस्काउंट के लिए आप मेरा कोड इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं CAKB10। आपको इन पर इमीडिएटली 10% डिस्काउंट मिलेगा। इसी तरीके से ग्रुप 2 के भी अलग अलग प्लान्स अवेलेबल हैं और अगर आप चाहें तो दोनों ग्रुप्स के अंदर भी आप ये प्लान्स अवेल कर सकते हैं। जो आपके प्लान्स को, आपके बजट को सूट करे, यू कैन टेक दीज प्लान्स और इन सभी प्लान्स पर आप अवेल कर सकते हैं 10% डिस्काउंट। इन सभी क्लासेस के लिए आपको लिंक मिलेगा डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स के अंदर एंड यू कैन सब्सक्राइब फॉर दीज प्लान्स एंड अवेल अ डिस्काउंट एज वेल। तो किस बात का इंतजार है, आइए लेट्स क्रैक इट। There are a couple of paragraphs which you can see are given in the standard, that is Index 1, which discusses the concept of a current as well as a non-current distinction. Well, typically there is a para number 60 as you can see, then there is a para number 63 and there is a para number 64. So what we need to do, we need to, read all these three paras and then, decide, what is the crux in terms of all these three paras. Well, if I read what is given in the para number 60, it says an entity shall present. The word is very clear. It says it shall present. The word shall is indicative that it is mandatory in nature. It says an entity shall present current and non-current assets and current and non-current liability as a separate classification in its balance sheet in accordance with the para number 66 to 76. Now, even if you look at the Schedule 3 and you look at the format of the balance sheet which is given in Division 2, it very clearly gives you that the assets are segregated in terms of current and non-current. And even the liabilities are segregated in terms of current and non-current in nature. And that's what, the para number 60 of Index 1 endorses, that it is something which is mandatory in nature. In fact, interestingly, if you look at one of the clarifications which is given in the education material on Index 1 issued by the Institute, it very clearly says that, is this something which is mandatory? And the answer is yes, it is mandatory. Every entity shall on a mandatory basis, make a distinction in terms of assets and liabilities being current as well as non-current in nature. But then you can see that there is an exception which says that when a presentation based on liquidity provides information that is reliable and more relevant. As we know that the objective of making the financial statements is always that they are reliable and relevant in nature. So there is an exception where the standard allows you to present the information on a liquidity basis, but then the question rises, what are those exceptions when a liquidity basis will be more relevant and reliable in nature? There is an explanation which is given in the para number 63. Then he says when that exception applies, an entity shall present all the assets and liability in the order of liquidity. So we can understand that there is an alternative. Instead of presenting the assets and liability on a current and a non-current classification, the standard gives you that there could be a situations where order of liquidity would make more sense. Now, what is that is given in para number 63. So you need to read the para number 60 along with the para number 63. It says for some entities such as financial institutions, a presentations of assets and liability in increasing or decreasing order of liquidity provides information that is relevant and reliable than a current or non-current distinction, because the entity is not supplying goods or services within a clearly identifiable operating cycle. Now we know that when you are presenting the assets and liability as current or non-current, the main, you can say the thin line of distinction is decided by the operating cycle. So when you look at the operating cycle of the entity, that decides what is current and what is non-current. Now for a financial institution, it may not be possible, it may not be clearly identifiable. The operating cycle may not be clearly identifiable. In those particular cases, the order of liquidity makes more sense. So in this particular case, that is a second kind of presentation. Another question which comes to the mind is it possible to go for a mixed presentation? One is that you go for a current and a non-current. Other is that you go in for an order of liquidity. Is it possible to go in for a mixed presentation? And the answer is yes. In fact, interestingly, if you look at the para number 64, it gives you an insight. In applying the para number 60, an entity is permitted to present some of the assets and liability using a current and non-current classification and others in the order of liquidity when this information would be more relevant and reliable. Thus, the need for a mixed basis of presentation would arise when the entity has got diverse operation, which means that if I look at the para number 60 along with the para number 63 and 64, remember the para number 63, 64 is an explanation to what is given in para number 60. And I think if you read all these three paras in a tandem, it brings out a very important aspect. That if you read the para number 60 along with the para number 63 and 64, we can see that there are three alternative ways of presentation. Though it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of, a very conscious decision to be taken by the company. But we can say one is that you reflect a current and non-current classification. One. Second is you go in for the order of liquidity. And third is you go for a mixed presentation, current, non-current for some assets and liability, and the order of liquidity in terms of other assets and liability. So in effect, you can say the distinction in terms of assets and liability being presented in the balance sheet is, you can say, three kinds of presentation. Though, of course, the most popular, leaving the exceptions of a mixed presentation and order of liquidity, is always a current and a non-current distinction. So that's all in this particular video. I hope you enjoyed the facts on this. Thank you for watching. Take care and goodbye.